The table looked the way I always imagined Christmas should look. My daughter-in-law had strung white lights along the mantel, and the smell of roasting turkey came through from the kitchen every time someone opened the door. My son had put on a jazz record, Coltrane, I think, or something close to it. And for a moment, standing in the doorway with my coat still on and my overnight bag in my hand, I let myself believe this was going to be a good visit. I should have trusted the feeling I had on the drive up from Guelph, the one that sat in my chest the whole 2 hours on the 401, quiet and heavy, like a stone I kept trying to ignore. My name is June. I am 67 years old. I spent 31 years as a registered nurse at Guelph General, and before that I raised 2 boys, mostly on my own, after my husband passed when they were still young. I am not a woman who collapses easily, but what happened that Christmas in my son's house in Barrie, what I found, what I understood, and what I did quietly the following morning, changed something in me that I am still learning to name. My younger son, Nathan, had moved to Barrie 4 years earlier with his wife, Cassandra, and their 2 kids. The older boy, Ryan, lives out in Victoria and couldn't make it that year. It was just going to be me, Nathan, Cassandra, their daughter Tessa, who was 12, and Cassandra's parents, who were driving up from Newmarket. I had contributed to the dinner. I always do. I brought my butter tarts, the ones with the slightly runny filling that Nathan used to ask for every year growing up, and a bottle of rye I knew my son liked, and a tin of shortbread I'd made the week before. I also transferred $300 into Nathan's account the week prior, because Cassandra had mentioned, casually, in a text that said far more than she probably intended, that things were a little tight this month with the heating bills. I had been sending money to Nathan for a long time by then, not every month, but often enough that it had stopped feeling like help and started feeling like something else. Something I didn't have a word for yet. The house smelled wonderful. Cassandra had outdone herself with the decorations. The kids were excited. Tessa ran up to me at the door and hugged me hard around the middle, and for a moment I forgot the weight in my chest entirely. We sat down to eat around 4 o'clock. Cassandra's parents, Dawn and Beverly, had arrived around noon, and the 4 adults, Nathan, Cassandra, Dawn, Beverly, had been in and out of the kitchen all afternoon with a kind of warm familiarity I found myself watching from the edges of. Nobody asked if I needed anything. November, a drink when they poured drinks. I got up and helped myself to a glass of water from the tap and sat back down in the armchair by the window, and nobody seemed to notice I'd moved at all. The table was set beautifully. Cassandra had used her good dishes, white with a thin gold rim, and there were cloth napkins folded into something elegant at each place. I noticed there were 5 place settings. 5. I counted again. Dawn, Beverly, Nathan, Cassandra, Tessa. 5. I sat for a moment with that. Then Nathan came in from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel, and said cheerfully, without quite meeting my eyes, "Mom, I thought you might be more comfortable eating in the living room, so you can put your feet up." He had set up a TV tray beside the armchair. On it was a plate that had already been made up for me. Turkey, yes, but the slices were the smaller ones from the edge of the bird. The stuffing was the scrapings from the bottom of the pan. The potatoes had been spooned out in a way that made it clear the serving dish had already been passed around the table before mine was put together. I looked at the plate. I looked at my son. He was already walking back toward the table. Tessa caught my eye from across the room. She was 12, but she understood something. I could see it in the way she looked at her plate, and then back at me, and then down again quickly. I ate my dinner in the living room by myself. The jazz record finished, and nobody put on another one. I could hear the conversation from the dining room. Something about Dawn's truck. Something about a hockey game. Something about Cassandra's sister who was pregnant again. My name came up once, briefly, and then the subject changed. I am 67 years old. I have buried a husband. I have worked 31 Christmas mornings in a hospital because someone had to. I have never in my life felt as invisible as I did that afternoon, with a TV tray in my lap and the sound of my own son laughing in the next room. I helped with the dishes afterward because that is who I am. I washed and Cassandra dried, and we talked about nothing. The weather driving up, whether Tessa's skating was going well, whether the Boxing Day sales were worth it this year. It was pleasant enough on the surface. Cassandra is not a cruel woman, I don't think, but there is a kind of thoughtlessness that can do the same damage as cruelty in the end. Nathan and Dawn had settled in front of the television by the time the dishes were done. Nobody suggested a card game. Nobody asked if I wanted tea. I made myself a cup of tea in their kitchen, found my overnight bag where I'd left it by the door, and carried it up to the guest room at the end of the hall. The guest room was cold, not uncomfortably so, but the vent had been mostly closed, I noticed, while the rest of the house was warm. I opened the vent myself. I unpacked my nightgown and my toiletry bag and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at my hands for a while. I was not going to cry about a plate of leftover turkey. That was not what this was. I got up and went to use the washroom. The guest bathroom was at the end of the hall, past the small office Nathan used for his bookkeeping work. He'd started a property management side business a couple of years ago, on top of his regular job. The door to the office was open. I wasn't looking for anything. I was walking past, but the desk light was on, and on top of the desk, open, was a manila folder. I stopped because my name was on the top sheet. I want to be precise about what happened next. I did not snoop. I did not rifle through drawers or open anything that was closed. I stood in the doorway and I read what was on the top page because my name was there in a printed document, and I had every right to know what it said. It was a form. I recognized it immediately. Not personally, but professionally. 31 years in healthcare administration, alongside my nursing work, meant I had seen these documents many times. It was a continuing power of attorney for property, a form used in Ontario to give another person legal authority to manage your financial affairs. My name was in the grantor line. Nathan's name was in the attorney line. The form was not signed, but it had been filled out, carefully, completely, in the fields that mattered. I stood there long enough to read it twice. Then I turned off the desk light, walked to the washroom, brushed my teeth, and went to bed. I did not sleep, but I lay very still, the way I used to do on overnight shifts when there was a patient I was watching, and I thought clearly and carefully about what I knew and what I needed to do. Here is what I knew. Nathan had not mentioned this to me. Not once. Not a phone call, not a text, not a casual mention over the dishes. He had had a legal document prepared, or mostly prepared, to give himself control of my finances, and he had said nothing. Here's what else I knew. I was not cognitively impaired. I had seen my GP in November for my annual physical. My blood work was fine. My memory was fine. I had managed my own affairs for 31 years without help, including the RRSPs I'd built up carefully over my career, the house I still owned outright in Guelph, the investments my financial advisor at TD had helped me structure after Nathan's father died. Nathan knew about all of it. I had been transparent with him because I trusted him, because he was my son. I also thought about the money, the transfers I had been making, the $300 last week, the $800 in September when Cassandra's car needed work, the $12 the previous spring that Nathan had said was for Tessa's hockey registration, but which I later understood had also covered something else, though he never said what. I had not kept close track because I had not wanted to. I had not wanted to be the kind of mother who kept a ledger on her own child. But lying there in the cold guest room, I started to add things up, and the number was much larger than I had let myself notice. I got up at 6:30. The house was silent. I dressed quietly and went downstairs and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with my phone. The first thing I did was call my financial advisor's mobile. I knew I would get voicemail. It was Christmas morning. But I left a message asking her to call me as soon as the holidays allowed, that I needed to review my accounts and add some security measures. In Ontario, I knew there are steps you can take. You can require dual signatures. You can set up notifications for large withdrawals. You can put a note on your file. The second thing I did was log into my online banking. I looked at my accounts. Everything was as I had left it. Nathan did not yet have access. The form had not been signed. I had time. The next thing I did was sit quietly with my coffee and think about what I wanted this relationship to look like going forward. Not in anger, not even in hurt exactly, in clarity. I heard footsteps on the stairs around 8. It was Tessa. She came into the kitchen in her pajamas and socks that were too big for her feet, and she looked at me, and then at the coffee maker. And then she said, "Did you sleep okay, Grandma?" "I did," I said. "Did you?" "Mostly." She poured herself a glass of juice. She was quiet for a moment, leaning against the counter, and then she said, not quite looking at me, "I thought you should have sat at the table with us." I looked at her. She was 12 years old, and she was looking at her juice glass very carefully. "Thank you for saying that," I said. She nodded. We sat together for a while in the quiet kitchen, and she told me about a book she was reading for school, something about a girl in northern Manitoba. And I listened and asked questions, and for a little while the morning felt almost like it should have felt. Nathan came down around 9. He was surprised to see me already up and dressed with my bag by the door. "I'm going to head home," I said. He looked at the bag. "It's Boxing Day tomorrow, Mom. We thought you were staying till the 27th. "I know," I said, "but I'd like to get on the road before the traffic picks up." He started to say something about the weather, about the drive, about there being no rush. I let him finish. Then I said calmly, and I want to be clear that I said this without raising my voice at all, "Nathan, I went past your office last night on my way to the washroom. The light was on. I saw what was on your desk." The color in his face changed. It was very quick, and then he controlled it. "Mom, that's not— I was going to talk to you about that. It's just something Cassandra and I thought might make things simpler. You know, as you get older." "I'm 67, I said. "I had my physical 6 weeks ago. I am not in cognitive decline. I did not ask you to manage my affairs, and you did not ask me if I would like you to." He opened his mouth. "I'm not angry," I said, and I meant it. "I understand that you're worried, but this is not the way to have that conversation, and I think you know that." Cassandra had appeared in the doorway of the kitchen by then, in her housecoat, holding her own coffee. She looked at Nathan and then at me. She did not say anything. "I'm going to call my financial advisor when the holidays are over," I said. "I'm going to review my accounts and update my file with a few things. And at some point, not today, not this week, I'd like us to sit down, the three of us, and have an actual conversation about what this was and why you felt you needed to do it this way." Nathan looked at the floor. "Do you understand what I mean?" I asked. He nodded. I said goodbye to Tessa, who hugged me for a long time. I told her to finish the book and let me know how it ended. She said she would. I drove home on the 400 South with the radio on low, the gray December sky wide and flat over the fields outside Barrie, the road mostly empty that early. I didn't cry, I thought. I thought about what I would say to my financial advisor. I thought about making an appointment with a lawyer who specialized in elder law. There were 2 in Guelph I had heard mentioned over the years. I thought about calling Ryan, my older son, not to complain, but just to tell him I loved him and to ask how he was doing. When I got home, I made a pot of tea and sat at my own kitchen table. My house was quiet in the way that houses are when they belong to you completely. The street outside was muffled under a thin layer of snow. The refrigerator made its small sound. The radiator clicked. I had lived in this house for 22 years. I had bought it myself after we moved to Guelph for my job, chosen it myself, repainted the kitchen twice, planted the garden in the backyard that I had let grow a little wild the past few summers because I liked it that way. I had paid off the mortgage 11 years early. Every corner of it was mine. Nobody was going to take that from me. In January, I met with my lawyer. She was a woman named, well, I will just say she was thorough and patient, and she did not make me feel foolish for not having taken these steps sooner. We updated my will. We put a continuing power of attorney in place, properly, with someone I chose, my closest friend, a woman I had known for 30 years, who had no financial interest in anything I owned, and who I trusted completely. We added a requirement that any changes to my banking required my presence in person, not just a signature on a form. My financial advisor set up email alerts on my accounts. Every transaction over $500 would trigger a notification to my phone. She also suggested I have a conversation with my bank branch directly, which I did. Nathan called me twice in January. I did not answer. I called him back in February after things were in place and we had a long conversation. I did not yell. I did not list grievances. I said only that I needed him to understand that what he had planned was a serious thing, and that if he had concerns about my future and my care, there were proper ways to address them that involved my consent and my participation. He apologized. I believed he was sorry for the way it had happened, if not entirely for the wanting of it. We are not where we were. Maybe we never will be. But we are somewhere. And somewhere is more than nothing. Cassandra sent me a text in March asking if I wanted to come up for Tessa's skating competition. I said yes. I sat in the stands in that cold arena in Barrie with a bad cup of coffee and a blanket over my lap, and I watched my granddaughter go around the ice with her chin up and her arms out, and I cheered for her the way grandmothers are supposed to. At dinner afterward, I sat at the table. The following autumn, I booked a trip to Portugal. 2 weeks, solo, a small hotel in Lisbon that a friend had recommended. Daily walks, local food, no itinerary worth the name. I had been meaning to go for years. There was always a reason to wait. I stopped waiting. I sat on a stone wall one afternoon outside a cafe in Alfama with a glass of wine and the sound of someone playing guitar drifting out from somewhere inside, and I looked out over the rooftops and the Tagus in the distance, and I thought, this is mine, this afternoon, this quiet, this life I built. I opened the window of my hotel room each morning, just enough to let the air move through, the way I liked it. That was enough. It was more than enough. I think about that TV tray a lot, not with bitterness that passed faster than I expected, but with a kind of clear-eyed recognition that I hadn't been paying attention for a very long time. Not to the signs, and not to myself. What happened in that house in Barrie was not the beginning of anything. It was the end of something that had been building quietly for years. And every transfer I made without asking why, and every time I said yes because it felt easier than the conversation that came with no. I had taught Nathan, without meaning to, that my resources were available and my boundaries were not real. That is not his fault entirely. It is something I participated in, slowly, over a long time. There is a kind of honesty that is very hard to practice, the kind where you look at your own role in a situation that hurt you. I did not want to be the mother who kept score, but I had confused generosity with surrender, and by the time I found that folder on Nathan's desk, he had perhaps genuinely stopped seeing the line between what was his and what was mine. That does not make what he did acceptable. It makes it understandable. And understanding it was what allowed me to respond with a clear head instead of a broken heart. What I did that Christmas morning, sitting alone at the kitchen table with my phone and my coffee before anyone else was awake, was not revenge. I want to be careful about that word. I moved money. I made calls. I put protections in place. I did it quietly and without drama because that is what the situation actually required. Not a confrontation at the breakfast table, not raised voices in front of Tessa, just a woman deciding calmly that her life and her work and her savings belonged to her and taking the steps to make that legally clear. That is what I would want anyone in my position to understand. The integrity of the response matters as much as the response itself. I could have screamed. I could have left a note on the kitchen counter spelling out everything I knew. I didn't, because it would have cost me something I wasn't willing to spend. My composure, my dignity, the kind of self-possession I had spent 67 years building, and that is the thing about difficult moments. They do not build character so much as they reveal it. I found out that morning that I was still, underneath everything, the woman who had worked 31 years in a hospital, who had raised 2 boys without falling apart, who had made hard decisions under pressure and kept going. That woman had not gone anywhere. She had just been too generous for too long with people who had stopped being grateful. The trip to Portugal was not a treat I gave myself. It was a statement. Not to Nathan or Cassandra. They never knew about it until I mentioned it months later. It was a statement to me that my years ahead were mine to spend, that the life I had worked for was not a waiting room for other people's needs. Tessa called me in January from her mother's phone to tell me she had finished the book. The girl in Manitoba made it home. I told her I was glad. Some things do find their way back.